Hi everybody, welcome to our second session of Church History Reformation. So it's our second series. We've jumped over the medieval church and we're now looking at the Reformation period, which had such an impact on everyday life, not only for Christians but for non-Christians, for everybody, people who were involved in commerce. It affected everything in life because the Word of God became preeminent. Now, why do church history? We've said it before. A good friend of mine who taught me many things said, because we need to learn the same things, the same lessons over and over again, because he said, rather unkindly, there's a new batch of fools born every generation. And as we saw in early church history, the same heresies, the same challenges, the same things that distract people from the true gospel and therefore from faith, from trust in Jesus, keep cropping up, and we need to know how to name them and challenge them. So we're looking at early church, we're looking at the Reformation, and we looked at last time at the background, the medieval background, politically, socially and religiously, to the Reformation, the background of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, the division of the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Roman Church. We looked at the invasions and incursions of the Muslims across northern Africa in the late 600s, into Palestine in 8 and 900, and even up to the very gates of Vienna in sometime around the 1400s. We looked at the destruction of the 1100-year-old monarchy or kingdom of Constantinople, or Byzantium as it was called, which is now Istanbul, and how that was conquered in 1453, and how that pushed new documents west, so that there was a new impetus to learning for the foundation of the Reformation. Today I'm going to look at a couple of things to finish off that aspect. We're going to look at the growth of population, the growth of money, and the growth of books, and how that challenged and changed society. And we're going to go through another couple of things: religious growth and unrest in politics and in nations in the West. And then we're going to start looking at the man, Martin Luther. After devastations by famine and plague in the 14th century, the population of Europe climbed to 60 million by 1500 and continued to grow steadily throughout the next 100 years. Some estimates said that during the plague of the 1340s and 50s and a little later, that the population was reduced to as little as 5 million, and that even in Elizabethan times the population of Britain at the start, they say, was only about 5 million. So already there has been recovery, population numbers, and a vast increase in population numbers throughout Western Europe, Christendom as we call it. And these things affect absolutely everything that goes on. So the shift to a capital-based economy instead of an agrarian economy. That agrarian is farming. We now go to capital, cash base. There were already well-established Venetian banks and Italian banks that people borrowed from in the 12 and 1300s. The Templars had a system of money lending, and as did the Jews. But now we move away from barter and farming to a capital-based economy. The middle classes were restless because their political power was negligible. They didn't have much political power, despite their newfound wealth. They'd gained a lot of money as merchants and through trade. There was also social unrest amongst the peasantry, the poorer people, and the countryside rural aristocracy, who were progressively being squeezed by inflation. Prices were rising, their crops and their industry was not worth as much, and they didn't get as much money in a capital-based economy as they used to. So they're paying higher prices. They don't have so much margins for pleasure, if there was any pleasure in those days. This inflation was due in part to Spanish and Portuguese silver and gold pouring into Europe from their South American colonies, but mainly to the demands of a growing population which outstripped supply. You know, when you have a supply of 5 things and there's only one person to feed, that person gets 5 things. Suddenly, when there are 5 people, those 5 things in the supply chain can only give 1 to each person. Problem is when you get 10 people and you can't divide the ones, 5 people go without. That's demand and supply. Such widespread social unrest had the potential to assist the development and spread of new ideas which held some promise of resolving these tensions. Of great importance was the growth in books, literacy and education. By the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s, printing presses existed in over 200 cities and towns. So the devolving of, or the distribution of literature was removed from the handwritten stuff of the monasteries. And of course, by the 1530s in Britain, anyway, the monasteries were being dissolved. So they ended up not being the focus, church-controlled literature being distributed, to ordinary secular printing presses who could print and produce written literature so much faster than the handwritten stuff, and they could spread pamphlets, ideas, and it was ordinary people who had control of those presses. Some 6 million books had been printed by the end of the 1400s, and half of the 30,000 titles were on religious subjects. In Germany alone, between 1518 and 1524, the crucial first years of the Reformation, the publication of books, which people could increasingly read because they were literate, increased by 700%. Estimates of literacy levels vary from overall 4% in Germany to 25% in urban England. Between 1300 and 1500, however, the number of European universities rose from 20 to 70. A major stimulus to higher education in this period was the growth of a movement known as humanism. It was not so much a movement as a cultural and educational programme seeking to restore classical elegance to European culture. By classical, we mean Roman and Greek culture. One of its major slogans was to the sources, which signalled a concern to engage directly with the ancient literature. Ancient languages were promoted and ancient texts used to detect inaccuracies in more modern translations. A critical literary scholarship emerged, which provided Christian scholars with more accurate texts of the Old and New Testaments, as well as resources to make the learning of the Bible languages easier. And these texts may have come in Greek or in Hebrew from the Byzantine Empire as it was crushed by the Muslims violently, and the monks and the religious people spread west with these books and texts, some of which got into the hands of one of the foremost humanists, Erasmus, a great scholar who would go back to the beginning. Incidentally, as a little excursus, one of the things we found is that very often, because the classical texts of Greek literature, of Roman literature and poetry were seen to be pagan and of no use, why would you want falseness when you've got the truth of the Bible? Very often, to save money, they would scrub out those Greek and Roman texts from their vellum, from their little skin sheets of writing paper, and then rewrite Bible texts or documents on them. And there were manners and ways, as there are today, of rediscovering those original writings underneath the Bible writings. And so there was a newfound interest in classical scholarship just because it was new. This new scholarship also exposed the fraudulent basis of some church teaching. The most celebrated example was the discovery that the document called the Donation of Constantine, giving the church from the Emperor Constantine various lands, was a forgery. This document was supposedly written by the Emperor Constantine between 274 and 337 AD, giving Rome and the western region of the empire to Pope Sylvester. Humanist research and scholarship was able to prove beyond doubt, however, that the document originated in the 8th century, 500 years after Constantine's death. The ability to read nurtured the self-esteem and critical ability of ordinary Christians. They now had access to authoritative versions of literary works. In addition, with the medieval church, while the medieval church had always forbidden the circulation of Bibles in your own language, Bibles in the vernacular, amongst the laity. With the growth of printing presses, this now proved impossible to control, except in England. On the continent, in Europe, between 1457 and 1500, over 100 vernacular own language versions of the Bible were printed. Two more important consequences of this literary boom for the success of the Reformation should be noted. Firstly, the abuses of late medieval religion were widely and critically publicised, adding further to the sense of religious unrest, which was an important backdrop for the Reformation. Secondly, Protestantism was a religion of the Word, of the Bible, and Christians believe the Word has real power. And its success, to a large extent, depended on literacy, that is, people being able to read, either already existent or readily available documents. Amongst those Bibles that were printed, obviously in some cases there were spelling mistakes or errors because the editing was not that accurate. And we have several things which are quite humorous. There is one very famous book, I think there are only a very few left in the world. One was called the Adulterer's Bible, because in the Ten Commandments it was misprinted that thou shalt not commit adultery, but that thou shalt commit adultery. So there were very humorous things going on with the printing as well. Religious growth and unease. Religious vitality. On the eve of the Reformation, there is some evidence of religious vitality. New churches, chapels and chantries. Chantries are chapels where people used to go and pay for prayer and songs to be sung to release people, in the imagination I guess, but release people from purgatory and speed their way to heaven. So you could pay a chantry chapel to keep praying, either to Mary or to the saints or to God or to Jesus, to dissipate and pay for their sins. This obviously, in real Christian understanding, was not proper theology. It was not good doctrine, because of course Christians believe that Jesus has already paid for our sins. So the chantry chapels were set up to release people from purgatory by the effort, the songs and the prayers of people. And of course, they took in money. Saints, pilgrimages and masses for the dead remained popular. Henry VII of England, for example, ordered 10,000 masses, that's a service, for his soul at 6pence each, believing that he would be released from purgatory by that payment and penance and prayer. Medieval men and women from all social classes participated in traditional religious activities in large numbers. Laymen endowed special preacherships to ensure regular sermons by qualified preachers. Sometimes these were called lectureships. There was, however, religious discontent. There is also evidence of widespread religious discontent. To some degree, the conciliar movement and the rise of popular devotional movements signal concern that the church as an institution was seen as both ineffective and corrupt. The chorus of protest and the criticism of clerical abuses, that is, vicars abusing, was getting stronger as the 15th century, the 1400s, came to an end. As we approach the 1500s, a number of trenchant criticisms of the church, penned by influential humanist figures, were published and gained wide circulation. I guess in many respects that was the contemporary version of TV. You just got to be discerning about what you're reading. On a totally different front, interest in the occult had risen to such an extent that official countermeasures had to be taken in the 1480s. That is, occult is of course Satanism and the like. Early calls for reform. There were radical calls for a return to a more simple biblical Christianity long before Luther. John Wycliffe, also spelt a Wycliffe, 1330 to 84 in England, and Jan Hus in Bohemia, that's modern Czechoslovakia, were both uncompromising in their rejection of a number of features of medieval Christianity. Though they and their followers were persecuted, Huss was treacherously executed by the same Council of Constance, which ended the Great Schism. Their call for reform continued to have an effect well into the 16th century. What they did not do, however, was to deal radically with the heart of the problem, the distorted understanding of the way of salvation. which saw it as a mixture of faith and works, believing in what God has done, but also what I must do to contribute to that. This detailed dismantling and replacement of medieval Catholic theology was only accomplished by Luther and his colleagues some 150 years after Wycliffe, and again a century after Jan Hus. So there is clear evidence that medieval Christians felt religiously oppressed by the external burden of church taxes, church courts, and church or clergy privileges. Apparently, I understand one of the privileges was if you could say the Lord's Prayer in a clergy court as a clergyman, you could get off crimes. I'm not really sure of the details. There was also an assault on religious feeling by the gross corruption and high luxury of the papacy, the monasteries, and many of the local priests. Nevertheless, in spite of this corruption and abuse, and the ever-present criticism of it, ordinary people not only persisted in their observance of religious practices, but did so with a fervour and frequency which spoke of a real commitment to the religious understanding which lay underneath it. How do we explain this paradox of rejecting the church because of its corruption and venal practice, and yet desiring to be fully involved in the services and traditions and religious rituals? How can we explain that apparent contradiction? The answer lies in a more basic oppression connected with the medieval penitential system. By the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church had developed a system of sacraments which controlled human life from the cradle to the grave. It almost regularly touched the life of the average Christian in the sacrament of penance. Everyone was required to attend confession regularly, and in the confessional the hope of heaven and the fear of purgatory were held before the believer. Detailed confession to a priest was required. Priests were given manuals to assist them in their rigorous interrogation of the penitent believer. Under what circumstances was the sin committed? With whom? What did you feel at the time? How sorry are you now? It was little short of religious and psychological abuse. The believer knew that confession and absolution would not be the end of the matter. Although the eternal guilt of the offence was remitted by absolution, there was a penalty to be paid in time, a penalty which could be calculated exactly. There was a formula, and what was not paid now must be worked off in the fires of purgatory. The soul required not only remission of guilt, but to be purified or sanctified by good works or pain in the fires, so that it became holy as God is holy in heaven. The last words you would hear as you left the confessional were not words of forgiveness and comfort, but pronouncement of a penalty and the threat of purgatory. In this way we can say that the medieval practice of penance had 4 steps. Contrition, that is proper sorrow for sin. Confession to a priest in detail, ignoring Jesus as our great high priest. Absolution, the remission or forgiveness of guilt. And satisfaction, a temporal penalty, a price to be paid now or in purgatory. Deliverance from this church oppression, this systemic oppression, required more than the correction of abuse. What was needed was an attack at the very foundation of the medieval teaching of salvation. Such an attack was provided by a German Bible scholar in the early years of the 1500s. And that's where we come to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a model of medieval piety. He was born on the 10th of November 1483 at Eisleben on the border of Saxony in the heart of a Germany which consisted of some 300 semi-autonomous political territories. Little countries, if you like, little duchies. His family was middle class, his father having moved from mine worker to mine owner by diligence, graft and hard work, and then to become a local magistrate. All the evidence points to Luther's childhood being pious, church-centred, with the usual strictness from caring medieval parents. His parents were naturally ambitious for their son because they were ambitious anyway, and Luther attended a series of progressive schools within 100 miles of his birthplace. At these schools, the young Martin was not only nurtured in the conventional piety of the period, including the modern devotion, but was also taught Latin and the Latin classics according to the new techniques fostered by the humanist studies and practice of scholarship. In 1501, in keeping with the wishes of his father, and I think he must have been 18 at the time, his father Hans, Martin entered the University of Erfurt to study arts and law. He was destined to be a lawyer. Big money even in those days. Erfurt was a traditional university where Martin studied scholastic philosophy according to the new way of William Ockham. Ockhamist philosophy, as we saw in our first study, stressed the absolute will of God and the priority of an almost blind faith over reason in the matter of knowing God. This knowledge came through the words of the Bible and the teachings of the Church. The new way was also optimistic about the human will and our ability to initiate the process of salvation. Martin Luther graduated from Erfurt with a Master of Arts in 1505, when he would have been 22. Luther was on the verge of a career in the law when he suddenly entered an Augustinian monastery as a monk. The catalyst, the cause of this change of direction, was a vow he made when caught in the middle of a thunderstorm near the town of Stottenheim on the 2nd of July 1505. He said, "Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk." Luther later recalled his determination to keep his vow. He told how he became a monk. "Later I regretted that I had made the vow, and many tried to dissuade me, but I persevered. And the day before St. Alexi's Day, I invited some of my very best friends to a farewell celebration in the hope that the following day they would escort me to the monastery. My father was angry about my vow, but I persisted in my determination. I thought I would never leave the monastery." All available records reveal that Luther took his spiritual duties as an Augustinian friar, a monk, most seriously. He entered the monastery on the 17th of July 1505 and took his final monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience in September 1506. He followed the usual course which led to his ordination as a priest in April 1507. In the monastery, Luther came under the care of Johannes von Staupitz, the vicar general of the order, the guy kind of over all those monasteries. Staupitz became his father confessor, his medieval guide, as it were, his personal tutor. In this role, Staupitz was the one to whom Luther turned when he was besieged by gnawing doubts concerning his acceptability to God. Luther may have been trained in the teaching of Occam with its optimistic view of human ability in this matter, but the teaching of Augustine of Hippo, the great theologian of Western Catholic Christianity and founder of his Augustinian monastic order, echoed a more biblical perspective, and this got to Luther. Men and women are unable to make themselves acceptable to God because their wills have been radically crippled by sin. Such teaching fed Luther's own acute awareness of his sinfulness and led to periods of intense despair. Staupitz, his guide, saw Luther often. "I tried to live according to the rule of the monastery, and I used to be contrite, to confess and enumerate my sins. I often repeated my confession and zealously performed my required penance, and yet my conscience would never give me assurance. But I was always doubting and said, 'You did not perform that correctly. You were not contrite enough. Your heart is not right. You left that out of your confession.'" Staupitz pointed Luther away from himself to the objective work of Christ on the cross, elsewhere. Not subjective, objective. Here was the answer to his sin and his anguish. This glimmer of life that Staupitz gave him, however, did not last for long. It had no theological root as yet. That would take time in God's providence. As well as being Vicar General of the Order, Staupitz was also Professor of Sacred Theology at the newly established University of Wittenberg. He recognised Luther's intellectual ability and tried to foster it. He organised with the priory of the monastery to set Luther the task of memorising the scriptures page by page. In 1508 it was arranged that Luther would go to university for a term to lecture in moral theology. He was also encouraged to pursue his own theological studies, and in October 1512 he was received as a Doctor of Theology and took up the post for which Staupitz had been grooming him. He replaced Staupitz as Professor of Sacred Theology at the university. He began to lecture directly on the text of the Bible, beginning with the Psalms, that's in 1513 to 14, in lecturing in Romans and Galatians, 1515 to 16, and finally in Hebrews, 1517 to 18. So Luther was, by Staupitz's direction and permission, liberated to study the Bible, which he did in the original languages. This young and anguished academic now thought less about himself and more about Jesus Christ. As he prepared his lectures on the Bible, in the course of these lectures, new and revolutionary light broke into Luther's darkness. He discovered the teaching of St. Paul in Romans on justification by faith alone. That is, being right not by what we do, but by trusting in what Jesus has done. And so Luther discovered three things about our salvation in the Bible. One, that God's righteousness is his gift to mankind, a gift not earned. Salvation has already been achieved in Jesus Christ, and the proper response is faith, trust. And the real Christian is both justified and a sinner at the same time and in the same body, both fitted for heaven and chained to earth, as it were. We both sin and are justified at the same time. In the Middle Ages, the righteousness of God was mainly thought of as the retributive justice of God, punishment, by which he punishes the sinner either in hell or in purgatory. Let me reiterate, purgatory is not real. It never was. It was made up from false teaching. And I understand that even the Roman Catholic Church, which for many centuries held on to the notion, has now disbanded the idea of purgatory. The paintings and the woodcuts of the period, with their depictions of Jesus as the stern judge, reinforced this. Luther had always focused on this aspect of God's justice, and he was terrified by it. You can imagine how he felt as he studied and lectured on the Psalms, for the word righteousness is everywhere. Right, being right with God. Luther's feelings of guilt and fear were only increased because he didn't feel righteous, right with God. It is clear, however, from the lecture material which has survived from those early days that Martin Luther was slowly starting to see that the righteousness of God is also and above all the way in which God has acted to rescue sinners. God's action came from outside the sinner and brings acquittal, justification, a declaration of innocence to the sinner. Luther came to think of salvation as something that God has already done for us, outside us, in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Righteousness is a gift. God's action inside us to make us holy is only the unfolding consequence of what has already been completed on the cross. When we have the forgiveness of sins, we have everything as far as God's estimate of us is concerned. After death, there waits not a purgatory to burn away the remaining elements of unrighteousness in us, but heaven itself, because in Jesus Christ we are already righteous by the free forgiveness of sins. Luther did not just fine-tune the medieval understanding of salvation. The theologians of the Middle Ages thought of salvation as a slow process in which Christians cooperate by their works, what they're doing, and they cooperate with the grace of God, which is acting in their soul. Luther destroyed this scheme by replacing it with the biblical stress on what God has already done for us in Jesus Christ. We already have the complete forgiveness of sins because of Jesus' death. Therefore, we cannot earn or merit salvation. This focus on what Jesus has done means we can enter into God's forgiveness only by faith, trusting that it is true, trusting that it happened, trusting that it is effective. That what Jesus did on the cross in the past was real, it happened, and it meant something. It does something for us with God. Luther later described his discovery and the liberation from spiritual anguish and depression it brought in the following way. Though I lived as a monk without reproach, doing everything right, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he was placated, given peace, appeased by my satisfaction, doing stuff. I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly I was angry with God. Nevertheless, I beat importunately upon Paul. At last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words, namely, in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. He who is righteous by faith will live. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous live by a gift of God. We are spared, given mercy, not hell but heaven, by God's gift. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith. Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself. Martin Luther was not just an academic at the university, he was first and foremost a pastor. Every week he preached at the parish church of Wittenberg, and every day he heard the confessions of his parishioners. So for the rest of his life, Luther's main aim was to take this discovery of justification by faith alone and make it understandable to the ordinary Christian. Luther redefined the Christian life and grounded it in the doctrine of justification by faith alone, using a simple slogan: simultaneously at the same time, simultaneously sinner and righteous. Putting this truth another way, Luther spoke of the Christian as one who is always a sinner, always penitent, that is, always saying sorry, but always righteous. As medieval Christians entered church, they were likely to pass under a stone carving which depicted the Christian life in graphic terms, a picture. In the middle of the scene was the figure of Christ, the righteous judge, with a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. On his right hand were the true Christians, the saints. They were few in number and sat impassively, halos above their heads, hands folded in serene contemplation and thought, untroubled by the temptations of sin. On the left-hand side of Jesus Christ were figures dressed in ordinary street clothes being assailed by the 7 deadly sins. They constituted a great crowd of people with much frantic activity. Demons busy with pitchforks violently dragged these sinners down into the fires of purgatory and hell. These were the untrue Christians, the semi-Christians, said the picture carved on the door. Ordinary churchgoers of Luther's day knew with whom they were meant to identify. They identified with those struggling with temptation, the false Christians, those destined for purgatory or even hell itself. Luther, however, turned this picture right around. The true Christians were not those on the right of the Saviour, serene, surrounded by little halos and in clean clothes, unassailed by any problems. But the true Christians were those on the left. The real Christian life is not serenity but struggle. Luther pointed out that Galatians 5:17 tells us authentic Christian living is a constant warfare between the spirit and the flesh, a constant battle against the temptations of the flesh, the world and the devil. Christians are therefore always sinners, but at the same time they have been justified, declared righteous, right with God by faith, by trust in what God has done, in history, in fact, and effectively. What should a Christian do when he's assaulted by temptations, sins, and is depressed by his ungodliness? Luther would ask his congregations. His answer brought genuine Christian confidence. Turn away to Christ, to the cross, and there in the forgiveness of sins see that you are justified by faith, made right with God, made innocent by trusting in what God has already done in Jesus. Luther often called the devil Dr. Comforter. In a strange way, the devil's temptations bring comfort to the Christian, for the devil only tempts those who belong to Christ. Temptation is the work of Dr. Comforter. The serene, impassive figures on the right hand of the picture above the door of Christ are left alone by Satan because they already belong to him, and for that reason they do not suffer from the 7 deadly sins. There's no doubt. There's no need for faith. They are the false Christians who do not struggle with the demons because they believe that by their works they are made right with God, trusting in their own righteousness, as the Bible would say. The genuine Christian recognizes his sinfulness and cannot trust in his works. Instead, the faith or trust or belief of Christians is in Christ and what he has done. Faith alone looks to Christ alone. Well, the prevailing Christian theology and the authority lay in the Roman Catholic Church. And so next week what we're going to do is look at Luther's break with Rome. Luther's new studies, new understanding, guided by God's Spirit and proclaimed to people, didn't involve the penances and payments and prayers of the church. It was not through the relationship with the Roman Catholic institution, but through a relationship with Jesus himself. And so something had to give. Like Jan Hus, who was executed for such faith, something had to happen. Either Luther had to go or the church had to go. And so next time we're going to look at Luther's break with Rome, how that happened and what it meant. So, okay, until then, do please feel free to continue. Remember, Nick Needham has a wonderful book on the Reformation as well. And if you have any questions, email me, please. God bless. Cheerio.